don't like.
Reverend Billy Graham's body is returned to his hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. The procession departed Saturday morning. It made its way through the town of Black Mountain. You see there people lined up to watch the motorcade pass through. A viewing will be held at the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte on Monday and Tuesday. Graham traveled the world preaching the message of the gospel. During his career, Graham counseled 12 presidents and preached hundreds of millions of people around the world. He died Wednesday at the age of 99. Graham Wacker is a CBS News consultant and analyst. He's also a professor at Duke Divinity School and author of a biography on Billy Graham. It's titled America's Pastor. He's on the phone and joins me now. As we are watching these images come through right now, as his body has just arrived at the Billy Graham Library, he was mentioned, as your book is titled, America's Pastor. He spoke so openly about death. What do you think he'll be remembered for?
I think his influence will take two forms. The first is his effort to make the gospel as inclusive as possible. He worked hard to erase as many boundaries as possible and stay within the principles of the gospel. But he wanted to work with people rather than alienate anyone. And so the inclusiveness, the breadth, the spread of the message was one legacy. The second legacy is really a more personal one, and that is the way he talked to people about a second chance in life. This is what they heard when they heard him preach, or when they wrote to him. They wrote about the way that their lives had gone off the tracks. And what he preached gave them a sense of a second chance. So I would say both the inclusiveness and the promise of the second chance were the main legacies that he'll leave us.
You talk about just how inclusive he was, reaching out to races and other ethnicities. How was his view on people who come from other faiths?
Well, he had good relationships throughout his life with Catholics, and for evangelical Protestants, that was saying a lot from the 1950s. So, quote, other faiths. For evangelical Protestants in 1950, Catholics certainly seemed to be of another faith, and Graham had no use for that whatsoever. So he and many Catholic leaders worked closely with him. He had many friends among the Jewish community, and he was very open with them. Of course, he said, we have different understandings of who the Messiah is, but we share many values about God and morality, faith. Now, it is true. One of the sad parts of Graham's life is that in 1972, he made some remarks with Richard Nixon about liberal Jews and the media. And they were released 30 years later, and he was mortified that he had said those things, and he apologized repeatedly. But one just has to acknowledge that that's one of the darker spots of the record. But with that exception, he worked very hard to work with Jews. In terms of people outside the Christian Jewish tradition entirely, he maintained a strong position that only God knows. That, his job as an evangelist was to proclaim the gospel, and would leave it up to God to decide what happens in the end. And again, he was very unusual among conservative Protestants who were very clear, what had to be done in order to get to heaven. He was just very clear. We preach the gospel, and then we leave the rest of the decision up to God.
You mentioned those remarks that he made during the Nixon years. He later apologized, but he also tried to take, as you mentioned, a more inclusive approach to his preaching. I want to play a bit of a speech that he gave in South Africa, the speech in 1963.
Okay. Jesus was a man. He was human. He was not a white man. He was not a black man. He came from that part of the world that touches Africa and Asia and Europe, and he probably had a brown skin. very much like some of the Indian people here today. Christianity is not a white man's religion, and don't let anybody ever tell you that it's white or black. Christ belongs to all people. He belongs to the whole world. His gospel is for everyone.
Christianity, not a white man's religion. What do you make of his speech in 1963?
That is a signature Graham speech, and he would repeat that line often, that Christianity is not a white religion. It's not a black religion. It's not a religion of any color whatsoever. It's a message that transcends race and ethnicity. Mm-hmm. He started desegregating his career. I mean, he's a Southerner. He grew up in the South, and his crusades were segregated until 1952, 53. It's not quite clear exactly when. They weren't asking those questions then, but in 52, 53, he decisively desegregated his crusades, and he received an enormous amount of criticism and received death threats for it. In 57, he invited Martin Luther King to speak at his landmark crusade in New York City. One has to say that in the mid-60s, the early 60s, he retreated some on his insistence on civil rights. Mm-hmm. Like many white people, he grew wary of black power. Mm-hmm. And so he did retreat some. I mean, he never took back the principle of civil rights, but he began to call for King and for other leaders to go more slowly, take a more measured approach. But by the 70s, he had certainly come out again. Strong affirmation.
We're looking at some of the images of Graham with the presidents, and in particular with Nixon, Richard Nixon. He was close to so many presidents, but he said he regretted standing by President Nixon during Watergate and also for supporting the Vietnam War. What do you think you learned from those experiences?
I think we could say that Nixon saved Graham.
In what way?
That sounds counterintuitive, but that when Nixon fell from grace in 74, Graham was slow to see it, but when he did see it, he was burned, and he determined that he would, from then on, try to keep partisanship out of the pulpit. Now, we have to be honest and say there were a couple of times when he fell off the wagon. I mean, he just couldn't stay out of it. He loved politics, and so he made his views clear. But he tried. He made the effort, and he encouraged young preachers, young evangelists, people younger than him. And he said repeatedly, "Do not make my mistake. This was the grievous mistake of my life. Mm-hmm. Don't do it."
He was once interviewed by journalist David Frost, and he was asked, "Are there any questions that you want to ask God when you get to heaven?" What did he say in that response?
No. He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "There will be many, many things that I will want to ask God." And then he went on to say that, he said, I hope God will let me edit the film of my life. He said, there are things that I would like to see edited out. Well, I wasn't there. I don't know what David Frost's reaction was, but I can only imagine, that David Frost was surprised by that answer, by the humility. I mean, this is just one of the hallmarks of Graham's life is absolutely genuine humility. Mm-hmm. And there was another. There was on another network. There was an interview with Graham, and they asked him about what he would do when he got to heaven. And once again, he said the same thing. He said, "I hope the Lord will let me edit the film." And then the interviewer said, "Well, if Billy Graham needs to edit the film of his life, I guess the rest of us are in trouble."
That says so much. Absolutely right. He also quoted John Donne, and particularly about the democracy of death, saying that it comes equally to us all and makes us all equal when it comes. Why was he so open about talking about death?
Well, that was at Richard Nixon's funeral. And he may have said it elsewhere, I know, but that was part of his eulogy sermon. not eulogy, but excuse me, his funeral homily at Nixon's funeral. And so it was appropriate that he was reflecting on the nature of death. And as he grew older, I mean, by that time, Graham himself was getting on in years. And as he grew older, he spent more time thinking about death and reflecting on what that transition meant. Actually, once my wife and I visited him when he was getting quite elderly. He was in his 90s, and he was having trouble getting up out of the chair. And he said to my wife, he said, "I've always been prepared to die. I haven't been prepared to get old." Mm. And, that line touched us a great deal because it told us about his humanity. Mm-hmm. So there's a theologian on one side, but there's also this very human sensibility person that goes with it. And I go back to the second chance comment I made earlier. I think people sensed that in him. They felt the genuineness that he touched them where they lived.
Grant, I want to ask you, is there anybody else in this world that you think could replace Billy Graham or come after Billy Graham?
No. I'm sorry for being so forthright about that. No, I don't think there will be a replacement. That's partly because his gifts are so rare. Just the combination of gifts are so rare. But I mean, in theory, someone could come along with those gifts. But the larger reason why I think there would be no replacement is the world has changed. Graham arose in the second half of the 20th century, and we moved on. It's a whole different world. He rose at a time when the family was gathered around a black and white television, and all of that's unimaginable today.
Yeah, those are my first memories of him. Between cartoons, scrolling through and watching him preaching on television, he had such a charismatic appeal to so many people, even if you weren't even part of the faith. Yeah.
Now, what he did say, though, I mean, he was asked this question several times toward the end, will there be a successor for you? And he, very interestingly, said yes, but he said the successor will actually be thousands of successors, and he said most of them will be people who never heard my name.
Wow.
And by that he meant people in the rest of the world, in those days, they were called the third world, but today we'd say developing world, a majority world. And he meant that the majority world is where his legacy would continue. And it would be continued by people who probably had not gone to seminary, who were not ordained, but rather who had, heard the message of faith and a new life in Christ. And so in that sense, yeah, there will not be another Graham, but there will be many, many Grahams. That's what he would say. That's what I would say.
Grant, we know that Reverend Graham will lie in honor in Capitol Rotunda this week. How significant of an honor is that, and what else do we know about his funeral?
I know only what I read in the newspapers. That, from what I understand, just reading this morning's paper, is that President Trump will be there, and it's likely that other former presidents, Carter and George W. Bush, and then Clinton, at least, perhaps the George H.W. Bush will be there. And anyway, there are likely to be other presidents, former presidents, as there were when the library was dedicated in 2007. All the former living presidents of the United States were there. George H.W. Bush and Clinton and Carter. And to the best of my knowledge, it's the only time all former living presidents came to an event to honor a religious leader. But anyway, in terms of his coming event, that's all that I know. But I think it's really telling. Well, I mean, I've read that Barack Obama will be there, and it's pretty significant, I think, to me, to think that Donald Trump and Barack Obama will be in the same setting to honor this man whose legacy is to reach across, to melt the boundaries.
So well said. Grant Wacker, we want to thank you very much for joining us as we have just watched Reverend Billy Graham's casket arrive at his library. Thank you for your time, Grant Wacker, and thank you very much for your fascinating biography as well.
Thank you.